Welcome, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, Translating Science to Your Table. Next slide. My name is Erin Thole, Health and Wellness Program Manager for Midwest Dairy Council, and I will be moderating today's presentation. Next slide. Midwest Dairy Council is hosting today's webinar. Midwest Dairy Council is an affiliate of National Dairy Council and is the Nutrition Education Division of Midwest Dairy Association. The council is dedicated to dairy nutrition research and education through the investment of more than 8,000 dairy farm families across 10 Midwestern states and is committed to child health and wellness through our collaborative program, Fuel Up to Play 60. Next slide. During today's presentation, you will learn about the process of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans and the role of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, the levels of evidence used in a systematic review and why few nutrient questions would be rated strong, a greater understanding of how the 2015 Dietary Guidelines of Americans differs from the 2010 Dietary Guidelines of Americans, including the 3 dietary patterns and the importance of dairy within each dietary pattern. And finally, the nutrients of concern and how dairy is an important source of those nutrients. Next slide. Finally, a few housekeeping reminders. All attendees are in listen-only mode as the webinar is being recorded. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar, but you may use the question box to write in questions at any point in time during the webinar. Within the next week, today's slide deck and your continuing education credits certificate will be sent to the email you have registered with. Next slide. Today's speaker is Joanne Slavin. Joanne is a professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition at the University of Minnesota and teaches advanced human nutrition. With the help of current and former graduate students, she has authored more than 250 scientific articles on dietary fiber, carbohydrates, whole grains, protein, and the role of diet in the disease prevention. Joanne was a member of the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. She is a science communicator for the Institute of Food Technologists and a member of numerous scientific societies, including the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and the American Society of Nutrition. Joanne has given more than 350 scientific presentations around the world. She received her BS, MS, and PhD degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, which she still owns with her 2 sisters today. It is now my pleasure to hand over the presentation to Dr. Joanne Slavin for the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, Translating Science to Your Table webinar. Joanne?
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate the kind introduction. Next slide. I want to first give some disclosures, and Erin's already told you a little bit about my background that shows you that I'm quite committed to dairy. So I did grow up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. We don't have cows on that farm anymore, but we do have crops, so I'm quite involved in the agricultural field. I also do research at the University of Minnesota and do teaching, which she talked about, but I also want to do some disclosures on scientific advisory boards that I currently am a member of, Peyton Lyle, Carry Ingredients, Atkins Nutritional, and Midwest Dairy Association. And right now, at this time, we have some current research projects that I would also like to disclose. We're doing a study on mushrooms and gut health. We also have a satiety and pulse study going on. USDA funded a fiber fermentation study. We have DSM, also a fiber fermentation study with microbiota changes. And we have PepsiCo, Quaker Oats funding a study on oatmeal and digestive health. So you can see most of our work is in the carbohydrates and digestive health field. Next slide. I want to start out with just how difficult it is to come up with recommendations. And this comes right out of Introductory to Nutrition. So go over on the left there. Where's the science? The RDAs. So you think, okay, I know what the RDAs are. The RDAs tell me how much of different nutrients I need. The RDAs have been around since the 1940s, and have really solved some important nutritional problems. So we don't have nutritional deficiencies anymore because we know if we have a glass of orange juice every day, we're not going to get scurvy. So all that information is in the RDAs, and then since 2002, it's in the dietary reference intake. So I always tell my students, this is the Bible of nutrition. We always need to go back and make sure that any changes we're making in diet, we can still get nutrients within people's diets. So really important. But also remember that the DRIs are not updated every 5 years. They are more of a point in time. We don't have a lot of new information on scurvy. We know that it can come back if we fail to get nutrients in the diet. So we always have to abide by those science rules that we have in the DRIs. As we move forward here, we have the report of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report from 2010, and that's the committee I served on. And I think if you think, how did the dietary guidelines ever happen? It's a pretty amazing process, and the U.S. is lucky enough to have this process that is mandated, it's funded, and they have to come out every 5 years. So unlike the DRIs, they're always needing to be updated. What are the relationships between diet and chronic diseases? So the DRIs are much more deficiency diseases. How do we not get deficiencies? We still have to abide by those rules, but as we move into the dietary guidelines, we say, what is it in the diet that affects my risk of getting a chronic disease? So it's a different way of coming up with an answer, and it's actually quite a bit more challenging than what we have for the DRIs. But the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is called together every 5 years to put together the scientific report to support the dietary guidelines for Americans. So having served on the 2010, you do get anybody can be nominated to be on the committee, and probably in the next year or two we'll be taking nominations for the 2020 dietary guidelines. And the more people we can get on those committees that understand diet, food science, food policy, the better off we're going to be, because it's a very important committee because it informs the relationships that go into the dietary guidelines. But I do want to point out that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is only advisory, and they are the science backstop for the dietary guidelines. So they have no role at all in coming up with the dietary guidelines. Those are done by Health and Human Services and the United States Department of Agriculture, and their staff come up with the dietary guidelines. And then past the dietary guidelines, we have some type of way of getting that out to the public. How does that translate into food? What kind of foods do you need to eat to actually get the nutrients and the best chance of having less chronic disease? So it's a big charge to get to my plate. And what you see there, my plate, is the same from the 2010 as it is for the 2015. So as we go through this today, I want to make a couple of points right here, how important it is to get the science right. Everything needs to be science-based, and it's a long journey to get to the end. So when people say, oh, you don't have that much science for this, we have to build on the past and make sure that we get the nutrients we need, but still move ahead with what are the relationships with chronic diseases. So a lot to do. Next slide. This is just how they progressed over time. And I think what I want to point out, they started in 1980. They have to come out every 5 years. It's mandated by law. And there's been a lot of discussion, why don't we change that? And that's possible that that could change, but for right now, there will be 2020 dietary guidelines that will come out, and we need to start working on those right away. Even from the beginning, if you go back, none of the things that were in 1980 have gone away and are wrong. They pretty much have gone forward and become a little more specific. So there's a little more specificity in our recommendations, but the same things that you see in 1980, you will see in 1985, 1990, 95. In 2000, a little bit different way of putting this together, how to get this information to the public. 2005, two things really, the trans fat, because in that document, the Scientific Advisory Committee report, they said there's no real safe level of trans fat. So then when you have an authoritative document like that saying that, then you get policy that says we will not have trans fats in our diet. The other thing in 2005, half of your serving should be whole grain. You actually have a number, and from there, policies are affected. So that's so often people say, who cares about the dietary guidelines? It's just you nutrition science people that get all excited about it, but they affect everything within the U.S. Food supply. So school programs, school lunch, obviously that's going to be affected. So anything that goes in there, we definitely want to get it right, because if we get it wrong, it affects children, programs, and labeling, everything like that, things you don't even think about. And remember, even though it is the U.S. dietary guidelines, a lot of countries don't have the resources to do their own dietary guidelines, so they typically will rely on the dietary guidelines for Americans. Next slide. So what's the process? And I got to tell you, before I was on the Dietary Guidelines Committee, I just thought, what is the big deal? Why don't they just get this done? I mean, who cares? There isn't that much new. Let's just move on. And yeah, that's great, but it's a long process, and it's good that it's a long process because it is an amazingly good process. So it's an evidence-based methodology used to review the science. Over on the left, we have the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee gets chartered. And when we were on the Dietary Guidelines Committee, there are 13. This time there's, the exact number is fairly, 10, 15 in that number, and they need to cover everything. So we need nutrition scientists, we need experts in carbohydrates, we need food safety people. And this is important because the people that get on that committee are going to affect the policy, and whatever the questions are that are going to be asked on that committee, there needs to be that expertise in the room. So chartering that DGAC is a key thing to make sure that you have the right expertise in the room. Once you have the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee chartered, then you have public meetings. And generally, some of those are done in person. A lot of them are done through webinars or electronically like that. But anybody can get on. Anybody can actually participate in the process. Anybody can turn in comments. There is one time where anyone who sits on the program can talk for 3 minutes. And, there are people from the public. Anybody, as long as you get online and get on the docket, you're allowed to talk at the meeting. And I think that's where other countries say, boy, it's an amazing process that it's that open. What happens next is the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee comes up with this report, and they submit that to the Secretaries of USDA and Health and Human Services. And at that point, that committee is disbanded. So they have no official role beyond that. They're gone, and then the dietary guidelines are not at all written by that committee, but the scientific basis in that report is used to help USDA and Health and Human Services write the dietary guidelines. And remember, then the dietary guidelines get implemented throughout all of the federal programs. And the reason that the dietary guidelines originally came together was to say we want the government to speak with one voice. So we don't want USDA saying do this and then Health and Human Services saying don't do this. We really want there to be some agreement on what's the best nutrition information we can give. Next slide. So this is the Nutrition Evidence Library, and if you've been on the A&D Nutrition Evidence Library, it's a similar setup that every Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee has a list of questions, the existing questions and then new questions they want to ask, and then they do a systematic review of that question. So that's one of the scientific topics they have, or one of the scientific methods they have to actually get information. And so the way they organize, they have to come up with these questions, they have to review the literature, and then come up with how good is the evidence between a dietary exposure and a disease outcome or health outcome. Next slide. So the NEL process is not that different if you go back to any review article you've ever written. Obviously, what's the question? What's the research question I want to know? For example, what's the relationship between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease? So there's my question, and these are all the things I have to do to come up with that question. And then after that, once we agree this is a question that we're going to go forward with, we're going to go to the literature, sort the literature, decide for that literature what we're going to include, search for the relevant studies, decide what's going to get excluded and included, take that evidence out with evidence worksheets. And if you've ever done this, it is tedious work. It's incredibly tedious work, but incredibly important. Summarize that evidence and then come up with a grade. And eventually then we'll have research recommendations. And the grading is really hard. So anybody who's ever done grading of papers or anything else, you come up with these are our criteria, this is how we're going to give points. In the end, we're going to decide is this strong, moderate, or is it limited? And in nutrition, typically there are very few things that get a strong grade, just because diet is one thing that affects diseases, lots of other things also affect it. So the process is very difficult. It's done within the Dietary Guidelines Committee, Advisory Committee, and subcommittee. So nobody can actually drive a question. So you'd say, oh, one person wrote this question and they had all of their bias built in, but that's not the way it works. There's always different people in that work group agreeing. They can put in their opinion and have a discussion of how strong is that evidence. Next slide. So one thing to remember, it's only human studies. So if you go back to the RDA and the DRIs, lots of animal studies and other research is used to come up with recommendations between deficiency diseases. But for the dietary guidelines, only human studies, only from developed countries, has to be published in English, has to be peer-reviewed journals. And then for each question you have, you come up with which kind of data are we going to look for. Maybe we only want a certain age. Maybe if 30% of the people dropped out of the study, we're not going to use that study. So what are the outcome measures and the study design? So every question, there's just a lot of discussion going on. How do we get the best studies? What do we include in our search and sort plan? Next slide. And here's just a little thing that we use for hierarchy of evidence. Most of what you know is down on the bottom, expert opinion. And we can say, well, that's pretty low level of evidence, which is the way this is set up. So if we go up on the top there and go to the next slide, things on the top are considered stronger, right? So a randomized controlled trial, double-blinded, that's great. That's a really strong study, but we have very few of those in nutrition, very few. Interventions, so I would go in and I'll give you an example. How about kale? You want to know what's the relationship between kale and health, right? So we could say, that's the question. We're going to feed kale to a bunch of people and we're going to measure something. Well, there's not very many of those studies that are done either because they're difficult to do. They're not real representative of any practical significance. So we know what's in kale. We can look at the nutrients that are in kale. We can go out and look at people that actually consume kale, and that would be an example of a prospective cohort study. So in these types of studies, you just follow people and figure out what they're eating and seeing if it's linked to diseases they get later. It's the strongest epidemiological study we have, but it's still an observational study. You know, it doesn't show cause and effect, it shows relationships. And so every question you have, as you go down this, you think, what kind of studies do we have? What kind of human studies do we have? We pull all that together, and in the end, the expert opinion is what really drives the day. We need to get experts together and say, based on the body of evidence, what's the body of evidence on this question? How strong a relationship and how strong can we make recommendations for diet? Next slide. Grading the strength of the evidence. And even you think, well, okay, are we done? No, of course we're not done. What's the quality? You know, and this is hard when you're a scientist. It's like, okay, what journal, what was it in? Was it done correctly? How do we feel about that? How many studies are there? Maybe there's one study that shows something and then the other studies don't show it, so we're not going to use that. Is it consistent? You know, a lot of things you can go out and pretty much 50-50, you know, so how strong is that? It can't be very strong. What's the impact? And then can we generalize? If all the studies are in young men, which is the typical problem in nutrition, can we really generalize to children or the elderly? Next slide. Okay, evidence analysis methodology. The advantage of this is that we should get rid of bias. It's a very rigorous procedure. Therefore, it's the best way we have of looking at these relationships. Bias, obviously, I just told you right up front, I'm incredibly biased. I grew up on a dairy farm. I'm very committed to dairy, right? But in this process, there are other people on the panel, and even though I want to say I want to drive my agenda, it's not possible for me to do this with this evidence analysis methodology. It's the strongest methodology we have. It's all out there for you to see. So you could go into those questions and say, which studies got in there? Why did they get in there? Why didn't they get in there? It's accessible. You can go in and look at it, defines the state of the science, and we can update it and tell us about what we should be doing for research. Next slide. I want to talk about food pattern modeling, and I didn't get this at all until I was the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. I thought, okay, I get science. Science is going to drive everything. But there's a lot of questions that we just can't do easily because we don't have data out there. So we can do modeling. We can, you know, basically sit at our computer and come up with examples and see if we did this, what would happen? We change this, what would happen? So we don't have to wait for people to get diseases and look at their diet. We can come up with other ways of getting to an answer. And so it really does fill in the gaps. Typically, what do we use? NHANES data. So in NHANES data, we have really good data on what people are eating, what are our shortfall nutrients, and what if we would change the diet really at the computer. So we change the diet, we put in those things, and we say, hey, you know, if we put in these food components, we actually can solve the problem. So that can be used in giving people recommendations for how do we put together diets. So as you move down the line, we have really strong science, but we still use modeling for a lot of things. Going into the 2010, there's an appendix that kind of shows what's possible. So, you know, if you say, okay, we're going to have a more vegetarian pattern and take these things out of the diet, what nutrients are not going to be met then if we do that? So, you know, I think that the other way to think about it is I take added sugar and I take solid fat from foods to reduce calories. So my recommendations for less solid fat, less added sugar are based on getting rid of calories, not a link to disease. And so often when people are like, oh, that relationship's not very strong, why do we move forward? Because it's the right thing to do. Obesity is a big problem. We need to remove calories. What are sources of calories that are associated with nutrients, added sugar, and solid fat? So we move ahead and try to limit those in the diet because they will help solve a problem, even though we don't have data that a certain percentage or a certain number of solid fat is linked to a disease outcome. Next slide. So here's just an example of modeling, and this is actually from the DRIs, because people are like, well, how did they come up with that idea? So here we have calcium on our y-axis, and then across our x-axis, these are actual, NHANES data of what kids' diets look like, what are they actually consuming, and how much of a percentage of added calories is in their diet. So we have 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and we get up to 25 to 30 and 30 to 35. So when kids are eating that much added sugar, they don't get enough calcium. So for the DRI, when they came up with how will we come up with an added sugar number, that's why that number is 25%. People are like, well, where did that number come from? It was just based on this modeling. Now, is that the right modeling? Is there a better way to model this to get the answer to that question? There very well could be. But this is just an example of how you can use modeling to answer questions when you can't wait to get the answer 20 years from now when you have more studies. Next slide. So here's just an example of how frustrating and confusing this is. So David Ludwig and Dr. Walt Willett are friends of mine that wrote this paper and said, well, wait a second, 3 daily servings of reduced fat milk, an evidence-based recommendation? I don't think so. So if you read the article, they said, we don't have any data that low-fat milk is healthier than high-fat milk. And if you get into the literature, that's true. There's growing acceptance that full-fat dairy, including cheese, is linked to less disease risk, not more than low-fat dairy. So you remember, we're looking at these prospective cohort studies that are observational. We're looking at food frequency. So how good is our data? We need to not we need to appreciate there's some deficiencies there. But even given that, across the board, full-fat dairy is not any more linked to a negative disease outcome than low-fat dairy. So that this whole review they're doing, they say we should get rid of low-fat dairy because we can't prove that it's got more of a link to disease. Well, got to remember that this recommendation for low-fat dairy is based on modeling. When you remove the fat, you remove calories, and you still get all the nutrients. So for dietary guidance for ages 2 and above, it makes perfect sense to actually recommend low-fat dairy to get rid of the calories. So recommendations in the dietary guidelines for Americans for lower solid fat and added sugar are based on nutrient density, not links to negative health outcomes. And it's a good idea. We have too many calories. It's one way of getting rid of calories, but it does create problems. And this is why one recommendation, unintended consequences of one, can affect another one and really lead to a lot of confusion. Next slide. So finally, like, boy, she's taken forever to get to why did I tune in today? So I tuned in today to look at the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, the 8th edition. One note thing, it says 2015 to 2020, and that's absolutely true. So the Dietary Guidelines do go for the next 5 years. Next slide. I just want to point out that MyPlate is still with us. So even though the Dietary Guidelines did change, the MyPlate is still the way that we get to giving out advice on what to consume, how many servings. Next slide. So what's different? I think people were really disappointed because they said, oh, we thought everything would change, and it can't change. Go back to 1980. We're not going to change everything in the diet. Things have to change slowly. So the 2010 versus 2015, you always have healthy eating patterns, but 2010 there was a big emphasis on calorie balance, getting out added sugars and solid fats. It's all the same, healthy eating patterns. Variety, nutrient density, always going to be there. Same thing in 2010. Limit calories from added sugars and saturated fat. Back in 2010, it was solid fat. It's the same recommendations. And remember, the dietary guidelines are for ages 2 and above, so it has a lot to get done. It's a really wide scope of people that you have to deal with. Healthier food and beverage options, that nothing real new there, but highlighted in 2015. And then the two things that are different really are no cholesterol limit. So since 1980, we have had a limit of 300 milligrams of cholesterol. And if you go back, that has really carried forward every year. until 2015. So I think you're going to see changes, and I always like to point out that what caused these changes was new science to support that dietary cholesterol does not affect disease risk. A lot of that research was funded by the Ag Board, and people will say, oh, well, that makes sense. I mean, they're the big cholesterol guys. But if you go around the world, the U.S. was really the only country where we had limits on dietary cholesterol. So the science was always there that dietary cholesterol in and of itself was not a big risk factor. So from now on, the dietary guidelines say we don't have to limit cholesterol. Remember, it's all still on our nutrition facts label. So as things change, people are like, well, let's change that immediately. It will take some time for that to change. The other thing that's different in 2015, and this is, I think, probably the major difference, is we have a 10% limit on added sugar. So before it said, you know, don't consume too many calories from solid fats and added sugar. Now we have a limit of 10%, which will affect policy. So next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the problems that what people are supposed to do and what they do never line up, unfortunately, in nutrition. So we have dietary guidelines. We've been telling people to eat these food groups and choose these foods, and typically they don't. So in this slide, we have the recommended intakes of dairy and the average intakes. And on the left, you have the males, and on the right, you have the females. And typically, we usually say, hey, you know, it's the females that aren't getting enough dairy, and they absolutely are not. If you look at ages, it drops very quickly after in a young age, but also in the men. I would always assume that men are going to consume more dairy than women, but actually it's actually a gap also. So for sure, despite what we tell people to consume dairy, they're not consuming the recommended amounts. Next slide. So I want to talk about eating patterns. And if you get into the dietary guidelines, people are like, oh, why do they come up with these different patterns? They want to have flexible ways to incorporate people's eating styles and to say you can just switch things up depending on how you want to eat foods. It's okay. So we have a U.S. style, which has always been there. And then there's a vegetarian style, but it is a lacto-ovo. So, and remember that these people, when they have to do modeling to come up with diets, they have to cover all the nutrients. And they have to cover it for people in usual eating patterns. So it's a real challenge to make this happen. There also is a Mediterranean that was talked about in 2010, but they didn't actually put in some dietary patterns. So if you're USDA and you have to give this information to all school lunch, WIC, all the different types of programs, it's actually really difficult to come up with more eating patterns, and they're not that different as far as the foods that are in them. Next slide. Here's just the example of the healthy U.S. style, the healthy vegetarian style, the healthy Mediterranean style, pretty darn close. So you have an extra half a serving in the fruit group for the Mediterranean, a little more grain in the vegetarian. But then people are like, well, how about dairy? Why did it go down to 2? Well, they added some other things. You looked at, there's more protein foods. So they've actually switched it up for that. The oils are the same. So, and remember, this is modeling. This is kind of hard to translate into how does that look, but it gives people the flexibility to pick the eating style that works better for them rather than have really strict, you must eat exactly this. Next slide. Okay, so some other points about dairy in the dietary guidelines. Next slide. So nutrients of concern. The 2015 really got away from nutrients and got very into food patterns, and that's great, because people eat foods, they don't eat nutrients, but at the end of the day, we really have to get nutrients into the foods that we tell people to consume. So that whole DRI area, that doesn't go away. We still have to see what are people consuming, what food choices are they making, and do they translate into nutrients. So looking at the new NHANES data, what do we see that is under concern? So it's the same as in 2010, nutrients of public health concern in the 2015 dietary guidelines, calcium, potassium, fiber, vitamin D. Same 4 that we found in 2010. Have we made any progress? You think, wow, we've been doing the dietary guidelines for a long time. We really haven't. Those are still problem nutrients. So we got to make sure that the foods that supply those nutrients are incorporated into our dietary guidance. Some of the other recommendations shift to eating more vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and dairy to increase these intakes of nutrients of concern. But as you look as a dietitian of those nutrients of concern, calcium and vitamin D are obviously very focused into the dairy group. So, if you say, let's just get rid of dairy, well, we could do that. We could get rid of dairy and do other things, replace them. But if you are going to do that, you got to make sure that whatever you're switching it up with has calcium and has vitamin D, and there really aren't alternatives to get there. I want to talk a little bit about just the scientific basis, and I've tried to hammer this home pretty much during this whole seminar, is that there's a lot of things that come into the scientific basis for these. So often people will say, oh, you know, why didn't they change that? Well, because the science, how good are these relationships between diet disease? That's what we're stuck with. And then we have to come up with foods that provide the nutrients that people need. So that will never go away. Next slide. A little bit on modeling. This is an interesting study of what would happen if people did follow the dietary guidelines. So we haven't gotten to do it in practice, but let's do it in the laboratory. We're going to go to our computer and say, let's make sure everybody took in the dairy servings that they were told to do in the 2010 dietary guidelines. Most children and adults don't do it. And things like calcium, magnesium, and vitamin A improve. There were also significant increases in vitamin D and a little change in potassium. So if we could get people to increase those servings by any source that they can, dairy source, whether it's yogurt, cheese, milk, we could actually make sure we don't have these shortfall nutrients in the 2020. Next slide. So I want to just point out these are the kinds of questions that are in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, Chapter 6, Question 6. What is the relationship between intake of added sugars and cardiovascular disease, body weight, type 2 diabetes, and dental caries? And if you, somebody came up to me once and said, it's really great to read the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report. If you want the scientific background on this question, you can go in there and all the reviews are done. But what you find is they said there was a strong relationship between added sugars and some of these disease outputs, disease outcomes, and therefore we will have added sugar labeling, and the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report is a scientific basis to support that. Next slide. And this is the new nutrition facts. If we do get a daily value for added sugars, which is supposed to be happening this month, of 10%, we will have a new nutrition facts panel. You see there's changes. The number of calories from fat went away because we're not very interested in that. We're going to have different nutrients. Some of the nutrients of concern will move onto this panel. And also we will have total carbohydrates, and within that sugars, and under that added sugars. You know, and if you get into the controversy here, is this confusing to consumers? And you know, the concern is that people want to know how much added sugar is in their food, and this will provide that. Next slide. So I like to talk a little bit about unintended consequences, because there's no question we want to get added sugar out of the diet. Absolutely. But how does it get into the diet, and what do we do when we remove it? And this is where nothing is as simple as a one nutrient show. So if we get after one thing, we cause problems in other problems. So here's an article by Bob Murray in Pediatrics, and it's a really good review of you know, trying to fix one problem but making a worse problem. So if you look at the school lunch program, flavored low-fat milks are chosen by 70% of school lunch participants. Low-fat milk without the fat may not taste as good to certain children, and therefore they would prefer the flavored that goes into that. He talks about that nutrition is particularly prone to white hat bias, that is, strongly held positions staked on moral certainty and proof not needed. So the added sugar being different than total sugar, we really don't have that on a scientific basis, but people want to get rid of added sugar, and we can justify that based on calories. So you know, you can see how we ended up with as much regulatory interest in added sugar as we have. But he goes back and talks about some of the other campaigns we've had: cholesterol, fat, high fructose corn syrup. All of those people were very sure that they needed to go away, and now as we've looked into those, the science was not as strong as it should have been. And so his point is that we were wrong and we did more harm than good, that by taking fat out of the diet back in the 80s, we have not affected the obesity problem at all. Next slide. So a little bit on chocolate milk. We'll continue. Next slide. This is a great review in nutrition reviews of, there's actually quite a few studies on flavored milk and nutrients. So this person looked at 53 studies have been published. What they found is children drink more flavored milk than plain milk. Well, we just saw that in the school lunch, right? When flavored milk is not available, children drink less plain milk. And this is what's different about the real world versus modeling. So if I'm modeling and I say, okay, we're not going to have chocolate milk, then children will drink low-fat milk instead. They don't have to. They really don't. They can just not drink milk. That's another choice they can make. And then if you look, what's the association between flavored milk and weight status? For normal weight children, it isn't there in these 53 studies. They couldn't find it. And then in obese children or overweight children, there was some data, some contradictory data on flavored milk, but it's very weak science-based that chocolate milk is linked to diet disease outcomes at all. And their conclusion, flavored milk is a palatable beverage choice that helps children to meet their calcium targets. So if we get dairy out of the diet, we're going to even be worse as far as delivering those nutrients. Next slide. A little bit on why has dairy been always there? For sure, calcium status and peak bone mass, and some interesting new information on osteoporosis, but we want to make sure everyone gets to their peak bone mass, and that is up to the age of 30. Consumption of foods with calcium and vitamin D is key to actually getting that peak bone mass where it needs to be. And these are across the board. So we have recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Dietary Guidelines, National Institutes of Health, FDA, that we really have to increase calcium and vitamin D. Those are nutrients of concern. Think of ways to get those to the broad population, the lowest income people out there. They need to be able to get an inexpensive source of those nutrients. Next slide. I'm going to finish up on just the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee 2015 created just a huge amount of excitement. And a lot of it was very negative to nutrition, unfortunately. So there are people that say, hey, you nutrition people don't know anything. It just looks like you're arguing and you can't support anything. And I think the frustrating thing was that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is an advisory committee, and they're given a lot of free rein to ask the questions that they want to ask, but they also have to ask what are the relationships between diet and diseases. So in their report, they had information that maybe taxes should be used to discourage consumption of sugary drinks, and that the effects of diet on the environment be considered when making dietary decisions. And those aren't wrong, that's not wrong information, but when it was in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, that created a lot of people being quite upset that that is not what they were charged to do. So if you go back to the original charge, the critics argued that these ideas were outside of the scope of the DGAC and charged that politics, not science, was driving the panel's recommendations. Next slide. So what's going on right now? We had a congressional hearing on the advisory panel's methods and passage of legislation that would deny funding of the next edition of the guidelines unless the Secretaries of Agriculture and Health and Human Services ensured that any revisions were based on significant scientific agreement and were limited in scope to nutritional and dietary information. So I think this is it's quite discouraging that this whole process has people feel like, oh, it's not working, and it's actually working really well. But it's as you get a larger scope, you run into these problems. So I think what we'll have to do is step back and decide what do we want the dietary guidelines to do, and if we want to expand the scope of the people on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, just make sure that experts, applied economists, people that understand behavior, people that understand, the effect of taxation and how that affects food behavior, those people need to be on those committees, or for the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee to bring in the experts to talk about that. Next slide. Right now, the Secretary of Agriculture engaged the National Academy of Medicine to conduct a comprehensive study of the entire process. He used to establish the advisory panel, which is the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And I mentioned before that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee did not really start right away. The first Dietary Guidelines did not have that, but that was brought in. And that the getting on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, it is in the Federal Register. They ask for nominations. Anybody can be nominated, but the next steps are thought to be not transparent enough to everyone. So how do you get on the Dietary Guidelines Committee, and should that committee be around for more than 5 years? It's kind of interesting. Somebody said to me, well, what do you get paid to be on the Dietary Guidelines Committee? And I said, nothing. You get like 2 years of your life where you work all the time. So it's an amazing honor because you actually get to give back and help come up with policy, but it is a huge amount of work. So, figuring out what that committee needs to do, what their scope is, and just being really clear on how you get on the committee, and to broaden the committee so there are experts in the areas where people want more information. They want more information on sustainability. Then if the dietary guidelines is going to cover that topic, then we ought to make sure those people are on the committee. Right now, USDA is conducting listening sessions to engage the broad nutrition community in this effort. So this is ongoing. The dietary guidelines are not going to go away. They will just get shored up a bit in the process of who will be on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. Next slide. So some conclusions. I want to talk about that evidence-based reviews are limited in their ability to define healthy foods. And I don't know about you, but whenever I had my soccer mom days, when they'd say, bring a healthy snack, I think, oh, I know too much. Is something high in fat not healthy? Now maybe nuts and cheese are healthy, which is good. Even though they're high in fat, I think they're healthy. But, it's really hard to say what's healthy and what isn't. So, if we say everything that's high in added sugar isn't healthy, that really causes problems for things like whole grain cereals. It causes problems for yogurts, things that we want to include in the diet. So if we have very strict limits on something, you can't be healthy if you have too much fat, then we cause these foods that we would now consider healthy to not be able to be sold at or included in school lunch. So nutrition isn't as easy as people think, eat this, not that. I wish it were that easy, but it never really gets us there when we say this is good, this is bad. So it's this middle ground that will continue to make it challenging but rewarding to work in that space. I also want people to understand that we have a lot of questions that we don't have answers to. So how important are fruits and vegetables for health outcomes? There's a lot of that, a lot of health fruits and vegetables that have never been studied at all. We know the nutrients that are in them. So we can look at that and say, okay, if you would eat more of this fruit, you would get more of these nutrients. But we have to use things like modeling to help set dietary guidelines. So look at the patterns we're recommending, the dietary patterns, and does that actually give us the nutrients we need? I always kind of point out that, and I did not get this till I was on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, but recommendations for less added sugar and saturated fat are based on empty calories, not health outcomes. And it really was started back in 2005 where they had SOFAs. So SOFAs were solid fats, added sugar, and alcohol. Alcohol is now off in its own little category because it really doesn't fit real well. So we have these empty calories, which are added sugars and saturated fats, and it's much easier to take them out in a modeling computer than it is in the real world. So anytime we say, okay, we're going to take out exactly this much added sugar, it may actually drive worse health choices. Same thing we used to have when we were doing everything on a low-fat way of looking. Strict rules on added sugar, saturated fat, or sodium make it difficult for nutrient-dense foods, including flavored milks, yogurts, protein snacks, fruit snacks, cheese, to be recommended. And if you go back, eggs would be in that category. So a lot of healthy foods over time, when we come up with numbers that we say, do not ever go over this number, and those foods no longer make it into a government program or a recommended list, it really could make things much worse than what we're trying to fix. So it's not as simple as people, when they come into nutrition and think, oh, well, let's solve this immediately. The more you know, the harder you understand how hard it is to solve a lot of these problems. The 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, you will see much greater scrutiny on the process to select, and if you're going to have discussions on sustainability, anything like that, you need to have some experts on that committee that understand the science and the science backup for those types of questions. And the other huge bit of big news is that the 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans will include recommendations for birth to 24 months. And as somebody who teaches life cycle nutrition, this is frightening to me because I think it's a medical thing. We want to make sure that we never make a mistake with little babies. So, the dietary guidelines, hopefully those recommendations, people that are on the committee need to have expertise in feeding young children and babies. So I find that the stakes are much higher for the 2020 dietary guidelines for Americans. So stay tuned, and I think the next time these come out, you will see some changes, and that will be definitely big news. Next slide.
Thank you,
I'm going to let Erin, thank you, Erin.
Yes, so thank you, Dr. Slavin, for providing us with an update on the 2015 dietary guidelines and how dairy remains an important part of dietary patterns. For more information on what you heard today during today's webinar, 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, Translating Science to Your Table, please refer to websites such as USDA, MyPlate, National Dairy Council, and Midwest Dairy Council. As a reminder, the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans focuses on the journey of eating healthy, where all foods and beverage choices count. This includes dairy. As shown in MyPlate, dairy continues to have an important role as part of a healthy diet, but dairy does not have to be the only thing that comes in the milk, which is outside of the plate. Dairy, like cheese and yogurt, fits into other categories such as protein and carbohydrates. To learn more about how to build a healthy eating style, please go to choosemyplate.gov. With that, I would like to take this opportunity to have Joanne Slavin answer some of your questions from today's webinar. So Joanne, one of the first questions, if you wouldn't mind answering, is the 10% limit on added sugar intake based on the modeling or science?
10% added sugar. So if you go into the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, the number one reference that they used was the WHO systematic review of added sugar. And so right now we're working on a large review of how we got to 10%. And I got to point out that it's really hard to put numbers on things. And how do those actually help consumers? Because, you know, obviously added sugar and total sugar for things like pop are the same. So, you know, if we say 10% added sugar, 10% sugar, how many calories is that? How many foods does that actually translate into? Every food has a different number. And, you know, calories don't count any differently whether it's total sugar or added sugar. Also, starch is the same as sugar. So that's, I think, the really hard thing with these numbers, that they work much better in modeling. So if I'm sitting here and saying, okay, modeling, the usual recommendation in the U.S. right now is 13% of our calories come from added sugar. Remember, added sugar is a calculated value. So our data on added sugar is also not very good. So my concern with this added sugar is people will be expecting a health benefit if they get down to 10% of their calories as added sugar. And the health benefit that was used in the WHO argument of how we're going to get, you know, why would we recommend 10%, is actually dental caries, and it's some data from the 1970s. So things have changed so much that most people would say, well, that's not, we're much more interested in obesity, we're much more interested in diabetes, but the links of added sugar to those outcomes are really weak. So this is what I think has created this problem, and it does go back to what Bob Murray's talking about, is everybody wants to be good. You know, like added sugar is not, it's extra calories. We want to take as much of it out of the diet as absolutely possible, but the numbers that people come up with are based on modeling and sitting in a laboratory rather than real numbers. So if you read the WHO document, they're even saying, let's get to 10 and then let's go down to 5. You know, and maybe we could get it to 0, right? And you're sitting there thinking, hey guys, you know, added sugar, there's a little bit of added sugar in everything, and that we'll never, even, you know, getting it to 13%, that's probably pretty good. Now, but if we got it down to 10, what would we expect to happen? We would hope maybe we would have fewer calories, but it kind of depends on what else gets switched up. So I find that this is, we're kind of creating the same problem we had, that people are going to say, why didn't you tell us that the science for this was so weak? And if I do get my diet down to 10% of calories from added sugar, I shouldn't expect something, a big improvement in a health outcome, because the data is really not strong at all. So I'm sorry to go off that long on it, but I find that it isn't a very practical dietary recommendation, and it's going to create a lot of problems, but it's also going to create a lot of work for people that need to get those labels. So it's good for people that understand how to label.
Great, thank you. And again, as a reminder, please type into the question box if you do have questions that you would like to be answered by Dr. Slavin. Dr. Slavin, the next question is regarding heart disease and saturated fat. What is the association and the recommendation for saturated fat, and is it based on reduced calories? And how do you provide education to consumers about monitoring saturated fat intake and heart disease?
Okay, thanks, Erin. We're at the University of Minnesota, and if you go back and look at the saturated fat hypothesis, it's actually pretty strong, and it's based on epidemiological data. So back in the 60s and the 70s, Dr. Ansel Keys here looked at the Mediterranean diet and other diets in the 7-country study and found that there was relationships with total fat and saturated fat and risk of cardiovascular disease. As we move forward, remember, this is why we came up with the recommendations in the 80s. The original dietary guidelines were really based on this, that we want to take saturated fat out of the diet. Saturated fat's the enemy. Take it out, take it out. And so we spent a lot of time doing that. But as science has evolved, we have found that, okay, there's definitely a relationship there, but it's not like the old relationships that if I give you vitamin C, I cure scurvy. You could be on a low saturated fat diet your whole life and still get cardiovascular disease. It's risk reduction. It's a different way of thinking. So I find that's where people are like, well, other countries in France, they don't worry about butter. They eat chocolate. They don't worry about it. Well, that's because of their thing. It's more of a portion size, and let's not worry about saturated fat specifically. So in the old way, the recommendation for saturated fat was 10% of calories, taking your fat and splitting it up. I don't think that's a bad recommendation. It's still with the 2015 recommendation. The thing I find really confusing, and this is when the modeling kind of crosses over in the science, it used to be added sugar and solid fat. Reduce those, and people would say, well, what's solid fat? It's not even on the label. At least saturated fat is on the label, so I'll get rid of saturated fat. But the problem with that is that just like all sugars and all fats have the same number of calories. So when you start saying get rid of saturated fat because that is saturated and solid are the same, well, but all fat has the same number of calories. So this is I always get into this when we try to micromanage the diet and run from our computer rather than real food. We run into these problems where people kind of out us later and say, what were you guys thinking? This wasn't well thought out. But you remember, it was put there to reduce calories. So it was kind of a way to reduce calories, and mostly in modeling rather than in food. So remember that for the 2015, the saturated fat is the same. It's 10% of your, that hasn't changed at all, but there is no restriction on cholesterol. So that's a big change, and I suspect that as you move forward in the 2020s, especially since we're going into kids, we're going to see a loosening on big recommendations to lower saturated fat, because the science has been pretty clear that just like when we talked about the dairy, that high-fat dairy doesn't have any real negative health consequences. So why are we cutting fat as much as we are?
Kind of going back to your question or your statement, Joanne, about children. The next question is, can you explain more about how the 2015 dietary guidelines for Americans affect school meals?
Yeah, I guess remember that the dietary guidelines is our official policy for school meals. And remember, everything flows from that. So as soon as the dietary guidelines change, and we have to have low fat, so going back to 1980, school lunch, the old school lunch thing was I had to have a third of the RDA, so it was based on that. And now it's like, no, we have to meet these things within the dietary guidelines. And here's an example of really the frustrating thing of taking the white hat bias and riding it all the way to jumping off the cliff. School lunch went from we should have some whole grains to we should have 100% whole grains, which makes no sense. Because what happens in the refined grains is you get all these things that are added to refined grains, including folic acid. So the dietary guidelines never said have 100% whole grains. They said have half of your grains as whole. That's a good middle of the road. But somebody on this committee that's working with school lunch said, well, if half is good, let's go all the way. And it's the same problem with sugar. Like, once we get it to 10, let's get it to 5, let's get it to 0. And if you're sitting at your computer, that sounds like a really good idea. Same thing with sodium, right? Let's just drive her down. Let's take her down to wherever we can go, but it doesn't reflect real food. And so that's the thing with the dietary guidelines. If you go back, they were much less quantitative because we get ourselves in trouble when we say, okay, everything in school lunch has to be whole grain. That's not practical. That doesn't make any sense. That we can only have this many milligrams of sodium in school lunch no matter what. Sodium goes with calories. So when we have adolescent boys in school lunch, those numbers don't compute. So that's, I think, that the dietary guidelines, though, do drive all policies. So when policies are made for school lunch, the WIC program, elderly feeding, the SNAP program, they have to say, we went with the experts, and therefore everything within the dietary guidelines fits within what we're talking about. So it drives all programs, and we may say that it's stupid and we're wasting a lot of time on it, but it affects everything we do in the U.S.
Great. Last question that we have time for today is, could you explain how the nutrients and the recommendations differ from milk and dairy or milk alternatives such as almond milk, soy, rice, and how that fits into the dietary guidelines and the nutrients of concern?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you really need to get nutrients of concern, and a lot of the alternative products are only as good as what people decide to fortify. And that's the frustrating thing. So when people say, oh, well, I don't drink cow's milk, I drink some other form of milk, well, that's a choice you can make, and this is why the dietary guidelines are set up to be flexible. But when you make that choice, you need, whether you're the parent or the school lunch administrator or anywhere, you have to make sure you look at the label and those nutrients of concern are put in there. Some of the, milk has 8 grams of protein per cup, right? So if you're using that as an alternative in a kid's feeding, then you got to make sure that it is an alternative. Some of these products have like 1 gram of low quality protein. That's really unfair to whoever you're switching that up with. And that's why when people say USDA is really slow to move on this, why don't they let more alternative products into the market? Because they're the backstop for making sure that these feeding programs provide the nutrients that are needed by those kids. So, until all of those other products that are out there, somebody's going to say you have to make sure you fit all the nutrients that you would get from 1 serving of dairy. USDA is going to be pretty slow to move on that because they are putting children at risk by going down that path.
Well, great. Thank you, Dr. Slavin, and thank you all for attending the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, Translating Science to Your Table webinar. Your continuing education credit from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and the slide deck will be sent out in an email within the next week. For additional dairy resources, please refer to the following websites, including MidwestDairy.com and our social media sites. Thanks again for joining today's webinar, and thank you, Dr. Slavin, as being a host by Midwest Dairy Council, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Erin.